Welcome back. Today we're going over circumference of circles, and with this one we need to have a little bit of vocabulary to figure out some of these pieces. The very first thing is that each circle has a lot of different working parts, and some of those parts can be defined quickly. The very first one we have here is a radius, and that's defined with the variable r, and that is the distance from the center of the circle to the outside edge. The next one would be a diameter, and a diameter is a straight line that passes through the center of the circle, and it has two endpoints on the circle. The third item is circumference, and that is the distance around a circle. So now here we have a circle. To label all of these parts, the very first thing is we label the center point, and that center point tells us that from there we can form a radius and a diameter. So to get a radius, we go from the center to the outside edge. And then to get a diameter, we have to pass through the center. So it doesn't matter where it passes through, as long as it starts on one end, passes through the center, and goes out the other end. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw a vertical line here and call that one the diameter. And then the circumference is the distance around that circle. So I'm going to go ahead and write that following the circle, so you know that the circumference is following the outside edge of that circle. Mike and his friends, they're working at a tire factory, and that factory manufactures several different sizes of tire for different vehicles, and it says here that we need to fill out the table to show how the diameter of the circumference, or how the diameter and the circumference of each tire are related. So we have our vehicles. We have a toddler bike, and the diameter of the tire is 14 inches. The circumference of that tire is 43.96 inches. And our ratio set up is y divided by x. So I have the 43.96, which is our tire circumference, and we divide that by the diameter of the tire. So I'm going to go ahead and label this just so I can remember that our diameter here is going to be x, because in our ratio it's y divided by x. And then that means the circumference is y. When I divide that out, if I were to simplify it, and some of them I might need to round, but it'll go ahead and be approximately 3.14. I'm going to go ahead and set up the second one, and that means that I take the circumference, 56.52 inches, and I'm going to divide it by 18 inches. So when I set that up, and if I were to type it in my calculator, I would find that that is going to be approximately 3.14 inches. Or in this case 3.14. So that number that it keeps simplifying to, you'll see a trend as this goes along. And for the car tire, we have it being 75.36 inches in circumference, and the diameter of that tire is 24 inches. So I set up my problem, and when I divide by 24, you'll go ahead and approximately get 3.14 again. And last but not least, we have a dump truck. That dump truck has a 113.04 inches of circumference, and it has a diameter of 36 inches. So I go ahead and divide that by the diameter, and then we would find out that that is approximately 3.14. And again, noticing the pattern here, for this scenario, it's looking at the circumference here. If we divide that circumference by the diameter, the result is always going to be an approximate of 3.14, and that 3.14 is something that we call pi, and that's something that you guys have already covered, but just a refresher. So when we simplify this, circumference divided by diameter, we get pi. Okay, so a circumference. The circumference can be used in several different things, but first off, it's the distance around the circle, and the two formulas that we use to find circumference are one to do with the diameter and one to do with the radius. So I know that circumference equals pi times diameter, or circumference equals 2 times pi times radius. Now these two formulas may look different, but if I were to take a radius, like this one right here for number 3, if I were to take this radius and I were to times it by 2, that would give me a diameter, because it would increase that all the way across. So that's why pi times diameter and 2 times pi times radius are the exact same thing. This is just looking at it from a diameter, and this one over here is looking at it from a radius. And then for the pi symbol, the approximation that we'll be using is 3.14. Starting out our first problem, the formula that I'm going to use for this one, will I use a diameter or a radius? And if we look at this, it says there's 6 inches, that goes to the center. It gives us a radius, so it's much easier just to plug in the radius formula. So we would have circumference equals 2 times pi times radius. We then plug in the values. So what that means is I say circumference equals 2 times 3.14, because that's what pi stands for. And then instead of putting an r here, what could I put? If we look back at our problem, it says there that the radius is 6 inches. So I'm going to substitute 6 in for that variable. Now, in terms of pi, is actually a really interesting thing, but to make it really simple, I'm going to go ahead and take this number here, and I'm going to ignore pi and multiply anything that's left over. So if I ignore 3.14, what's 2 times 6? If we were to multiply 2 by 6, we would get 12. So in terms of pi, I would go ahead and just say circumference equals 12 pi. It's probably the easiest thing to write, but there are a few occasions where you would do that. But for now, we're just going to find out the circumference and terms of pi together. To get the circumference, I would go ahead and take 2 times 3.14 times 6. If you multiplied those three numbers together, you would get an approximate answer of 37.68 inches. Number 2. Because this one has a diameter of 14 centimeters, I'm going to go ahead and use the diameter formula here. So I go circumference equals pi times diameter. I then plug in the values. I don't know circumference, so I'm going to go ahead and say circumference equals. Instead of saying pi, I'm going to say 3.14. And instead of saying diameter, I'm going to say 14 centimeters. In terms of pi, this one's already done. All I have to do is write out circumference equals, ignore the pi, and there's nothing to multiply 14 by. So then the answer for terms of pi is just 14 pi. For circumference, I would then multiply 3.14 times 14 for a grand total of 43.96 centimeters. Number 3. I look at this one and notice it's a radius because it only goes to the center. And that radius, for our formula here, we would go ahead and do circumference equals 2 times pi times radius. I then plug in the values, and that would be circumference equals 2 times 3.14. And instead of writing r, I would write 3.5 meters. And then in terms of pi, I ignore the 3.14, and I would multiply 2 times 3.5, which would give me 7. So my terms of pi answer would be circumference equals 7 pi. I then take 7 and multiply it by 3.14, and I would get the 21.98, and that's 21.98 meters. Next question. So here we have a problem about a Ferris wheel, and we got to answer 4 questions for this Ferris wheel problem. The very first thing on this you'll notice is that this Ferris wheel is traveling in a circular motion, so it's forming a circumference as it travels. And it says there that it measures 40 meters from the top of the car to the bottom car. So from the top car to the bottom car, that means from these 2 points, it's measuring 40 meters. And that measurement from the circle, that looks like a diameter because it's going all the way across through that center part. And since it's measuring that 40 meters, then that means if we were to find out the radius here, if all the way across is 40, what's halfway across? Well, if all the way across is 40, then halfway across we would have a radius of 20 meters. And we've already talked about the diameter going all the way across the circle through the center, and that means that we would have a diameter of 40 meters. And now we can go ahead and answer the question about this one of these cars traveling around one complete time. How many meters did it travel? Well, using the circumference formula, we can find that out. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use the circumference formula for diameter. You could have used radius, it doesn't matter. But instead of writing diameter, I'm going to go ahead and plug in this 40 meters. So I say circumference equals pi times 40. And that's 3.14 times 40. When I multiply those two together, I get 125.6 meters, and that's how far around it will travel. So to kind of put it in perspective, that's like traveling a full football field and then 25 more meters. So it's a pretty big Ferris wheel ride. And then letter D, our last problem here. Another Ferris wheel. The car can travel 100.48 meters to go once around the Ferris wheel. What's the height from the top car to the bottom car? Now this one's kind of tricky because it tells us the distance traveled around. It doesn't tell us the radius or the diameter, but we can take the distance traveled around like we did before, and if we were to divide it, we can find our answer. So what we need to do with this one is we need to change our formula. Instead of finding circumference, we need to find diameter. So to do that, I just solve for diameter. So I don't want to multiply by pi here. I actually want to get rid of pi so I can find out what diameter equals. To get rid of pi, I divide instead of multiply. And whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other. If I do that, the pi's cancel on the right, and that leaves me with circumference divided by pi. So I know that diameter is equal to circumference divided by pi. Then I can take my information and plug it in. In this case, the circumference is 100.48 meters. So I plug in the 100.48 meters, and I'm going to divide that by pi. So I go ahead and divide that by 3.14, and the approximation answer there, if I were to divide that out, we would get 32 meters. So I know that from the top car to the bottom car is at 32 meters, which is still a fairly big Ferris wheel. Alright, I hope this information was helpful for you. If you have any questions, please let me know, and have a great day.